this is my review of Mob Psycho 100. Okay, so in this episode, Teru has basically decided that Mob is indeed his enemy. Here's the whole thing about Teru. Teru has gone through his entire life using his psychic powers to become the best person he can possibly be, or at the very least, uses them to try and make himself feel a bit more special than he actually is. And when he finds out that Mob also has psychic powers, Teru can't handle it and tries to attack Mob, trying to assert his dominance, something that Dimple easily identifies and is able to sympathize with. And while Teru is actively using his psychic powers to fight Mob is standing his ground, refusing to use his psychic powers on Teru at all, pointing out a conversation with Reagan he had about how his psychic powers are inherently the same as someone who's really smart or really fast or really strong. And also points out that using psychic powers or any of those against a person is kind of like pointing a knife at somebody. And Dimple points out that it kind of loses its meaning when Reagan says it, but the message couldn't be any stronger. At which point, Teru actually beats up Mob and sends him flying around the place using his psychic powers, and is telling Mob that if he doesn't use his powers, then he's no different from the rest of everybody else who doesn't have psychic powers, and that he shouldn't stoop to their level. At which point, Dimple finally has enough and confronts Teru, pointing out that Mob isn't going to fight him, so he might as well just give it up. And when Teru refuses to listen, Dimple takes on his muscle form again and points out that while he is significantly weaker than he used to be, he should be able to deal out some discipline. And also states that Mob is special and shouldn't be treated like some sort of gutter rat, which Teru definitely is. But then Teru exercises him in the middle of his speech and doesn't really pay much mind to Dimple's speech. After seeing Dimple get exercised, Mob starts to, I guess, fall apart internally and starts to have a bit of a breakdown, just a little bit. And while he's physically fine on the outside, he does realize that in a way Dimple was at the very least better than Teru. And after hearing that, then gives Teru a lecture about why he believes he's so special and why he's more special than anybody else. And Teru, unable to cope with the fact that he might be wrong, attacks Mob and sends him flying into the building. And they fly into a classroom, with Teru attempting to perform an endurance test on Mob using his psychic powers to send him flying through the wall. And Mob is very adamant on the fact that he shouldn't be using his psychic powers, and that if it wasn't him, anybody else would get hurt if they used their psychic powers. And at which point Mob goes flying through the wall into the culinary room, and Teru decides to use some knives to attack Mob, which is the exact thing that Mob had remembered not to do with his psychic powers, quite literally in the sense. And Mob deflects the knives, pointing out that it's dangerous to throw knives at people, especially with psychic powers on to boot. And he accidentally shaves the top of Teru's head, which makes him a bit bald. And after realizing his hair is now gone, Teru freaks out, takes off his tie, and transforms it into a sword using his psychic powers, and begins attacking Mob with blasts of psychic energy from the sword tie. At which point, Mob points out that the main reason he's not using his psychic powers is that he wants to better himself, and also points out during this fight that he finally realizes why Teru is using his psychic powers so adamantly, because he realizes that he and Mob are basically the same person, more or less. They're on opposite ends of the spectrum, but the central feeling is the same. If you take away their psychic powers, there's nothing else there of value. And points out that Teru is probably freaking out internally because he believes because he believes that if his psychic powers weren't ever present in the first place, he wouldn't be as popular as he is. And Teru, upon hearing that, attacks Mob and slams him against the wall and starts choking him. And Mob, despite this, refuses to fight back. And when Teru begins to confront him and tells him that he needs to use his psychic powers to defend himself, Mob instead throws a really weak punch and then another one. And Teru starts crying, realizing that he could kill Mob that he might kill Mob if Mob doesn't defend himself. And eventually Mob does pass out, but not before having a flashback about a time he passed out before, and how Mob kind of did some damage to a bunch of thugs a while back to defend his brother Ritsu. So, and that same thing happens again. He passes out, and Teru, believing the fight is over, walks away. Or so he thinks. So, what happens next is probably one of the more interesting points of the show. So Mob gets back up after passing out, sort of, but it's not Mob. It's actually a completely separate entity that is established to be a separate entity from Mob several times over by the end of the series. And it's revealed, and it's this entity called Triple Question Mark. It looks like Mob, but is actually just a manifestation of his psychic powers, and it comes out whenever Mob is knocked out and unable to function as a person. So, and Teru initially believes that he's finally gotten Mob to break free from his ideals and use his psychic powers, but quickly realizes that Mob is indeed unconscious during the remainder of the fight. And then Triple Question Mark completely strips Teru and destroys the entire building around them, sending Teru and the debris flying into the sky, while Teru cries out that he's never going to use his psychic powers anymore on people, before going above the cloud line and coming at peace after stopping, and realizes that maybe he is just an ordinary guy after all. At which point Mob has finally woken up and realizing what he's done, and realizing that he failed to change who he was, mainly so that he could stop the psychic entity that lives inside him from going rampant on everybody, begins to reach his second explosion of the series and goes and unleashes his sadness, which just puts the entire building back together, and Mob is finally able to just calm down and get all of his sadness out of his system. At which point Teru points out that he may not be right anymore, and that Mob might have a point. At which point all of Teru's thug buddies wake up and realize that Teru did indeed lose the fight and was shaved, stripped, and beaten. So, and then they run inside because they don't want that to happen to them. And Teru realizes that's exactly as Mob says, and thanks Mob for opening his eyes before the Body Improvement Club takes Mob away and continues with their training. After which, Mob spends the next 3 hours looking for Dimple to no avail, and decides to go back home, despite being in the rain. And Ritsu hands him a towel while he's in his room, and Mob apologizes to Ritsu for what happened back then, pointing at and asks Ritsu what actually happened. And Ritsu lies to him and tells him that it was because of what the thugs did and that Mob had nothing to do with it, when in actuality, Mob had pretty much everything to do with it. And then we see what actually happened. When Mob passed out, his psychic powers got unleashed, and he basically messed up everybody in the immediate vicinity. At which point Ritsu begins watching the news coverage of what happened during the fight on the television, and points out that it isn't actually Mob. So, yeah, it is clear in this episode that the entity within Mob is its own separate entity, as I said. But it is a very powerful entity nonetheless, but thankfully it only comes out when Mob is completely unconscious. Like when his brain's completely gone, completely dead, that's when it comes out to play. But other than that, Mob is pretty much in control of it, so it's not really that big a deal, provided he doesn't get knocked out. So, yeah, this episode was mainly to showcase that Teru is indeed going to change his ways and become a better person. And he does. He becomes a recurring character in the series, but
but instead of being rivals with Mob like he was initially, he instead starts to become a friend and starts to work on improving his psychic powers, but not in a way that's going to hurt anybody else. So yeah, Teru slowly has started to redeem himself and starts to become a better person as time goes on. And we also get an introduction to Triple Question Mark, which is one of the final antagonists of the series, because it's literally Mob eventually coming to confront himself, quite literally, because no matter how much it's pointed out that no matter how much you change, you have to be able to change yourself inside as well as outside. And if you can't do that, then there's really no point in changing yourself. And that's a really good message for the series to end off on, but we're not there yet. But yeah, the series is amazing, and that is definitely going to be a plot point going forward. So keep an eye out for that. But this episode establishes that yes, Mob is mainly sticking to his ideals and wants to change himself because of that accident many years ago. So he's trying to prevent another accident like that from happening, and obviously he failed. So, if you guys have seen this episode of Mob Psycho 100, what did you guys think? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord server, link in the description. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on Facebook and on Twitter in the description below. And also, check out my Patreon description below as well. It's only a couple bucks a month, and it really helps me out, so I would definitely appreciate it if you did that. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, I will see you guys in the next video. Peace!